Hello and welcome everyone! I had a pun lined up for today's pierogi video, but it was too cheesy. You could say it's my prerogative to leave it out. Sorry, I couldn't think of a cheddar pun. Today we're making pierogi, which despite sounding weird to an English ear, is actually the plural. These European dumplings are fantastic as a meal, side, or snack. We're going to be making two types of pierogi today. First, potato, cottage cheese, and onion, and second, potato and cheddar cheese. Of course, you can fill your pierogi with anything you like, and the choices of filling are vast, ranging from sweet to savory. For today's recipe, you will need, for the dough, 2 cups of flour, more if needed, 2 eggs, 1/3 of a cup of water, more if needed, 1/2 teaspoon of salt. For the cottage cheese filling, 3 to 5 large russet potatoes, a large onion, 1 to 2 cups of dry cottage cheese, 1 stick or 1/2 cup of butter, 2 eggs, as well as salt and pepper to taste. For the cheddar cheese filling, 3 to 5 large russet potatoes, 2 cups of grated cheddar cheese, 2 tablespoons of butter, and salt and pepper to taste. To begin, we are going to prepare our dough. This dough recipe can easily be scaled up depending on how much filling you have. Beat together the eggs in warm water, then stir in the salt. Next, add in your flour and using a fork, mix everything together. If you find some of your flour will not incorporate into the dough easily, simply sprinkle in a bit of extra water until everything combines nicely. The dough should become difficult to stir with the fork, and when it does, we can begin to knead it all together. The final dough should be soft. If it is too sticky to work with, simply work in a bit more flour in small amounts. We want the dough to stay somewhat sticky. If it is too dry, it won't be able to stick to itself, and your pierogis will never seal. Once the dough is kneaded, wrap it in plastic and set it aside for 30 to 60 minutes, or you can toss it into the refrigerator overnight. It may take more than one batch of dough to use up all of the filling that you have. I recommend working in single batches until you get lots of practice at it. Next, we're going to prepare our potatoes for the fillings. This step is the same for both fillings. Peel the potatoes, then cut them up into chunks and submerge them in water on the stove. Simmer them until the potatoes are tender, and once tender, drain them. For the cottage cheese pierogi filling, finely chop your onion and cook it in the 1/2 cup of butter. I personally like to cook my onions until they are nicely caramelized, but you can stop cooking them when they are translucent if you prefer. Once the onions are cooked, add them to the potatoes and mash everything together. You want the consistency to be like smooth mashed potatoes, ignoring the chunks of onion, of course. Once the potatoes and onions are mashed, we are going to add our cottage cheese. How much cottage cheese to add is entirely up to you. A good rule of thumb, though, is at least a 2-to-1 ratio of potatoes to cottage cheese. But you can add more or less to your tastes. Dry cottage cheese has a tendency to clump up, so it's helpful to rub it between your hands in order to break up any large clumps. Then, thoroughly mix the potatoes into the cheese. Finally, season with salt and pepper to taste, then add the eggs and give it one final thorough mixing. Once the filling is prepared, you can cover it with plastic and set it in the fridge. You can make the filling ahead of time, just be aware that cold filling will affect the cooking time somewhat later. For the cheddar cheese pierogi filling, return the drained potatoes to the stove. Then dump in the butter and cheddar cheese and begin mashing. Mash well until all of the cheese is melted and the potatoes are smooth and creamy. Remove it from the heat, taste and season with salt and pepper, and once it is done, cover it with plastic and set it in the refrigerator just like the other filling. Now we can begin forming our pierogi. First, make a bed of flour and place your dough in the center. Gently press the dough down and then begin the rolling process. You want to roll out the dough until it is reasonably thin, between 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch or 1.5 to 3 millimeters thick. Once the dough is rolled out, take a tablespoon of the filling and plop it next to the edge of the dough. Lift the edge and roll the filling until it is completely sealed. Then carefully press into a half circle with the side of your pinky. Be sure to squeeze out as much air as possible from the pierogi, then firmly press all around the dough. Now, using a round cutter or a drinking glass, cut it out by pressing very firmly and using a rolling motion to seal the edge of the dumpling. If you want to be extra sure that they are sealed, you can firmly pinch along the entire seam. Repeat the process until you run out of dough or filling. Dough scraps can be formed back into a ball and re-rolled, though this will result in a slightly tougher dough. Unless a substantial amount of dough remains, I recommend using a fresh batch. Besides, the scraps are delicious fried up in butter. When all of the pierogi are formed, you can transfer them to a Ziploc bag. I recommend dusting them heavily with flour so that none of them stick together. If you want, you can freeze them at this stage. We like to boil our pierogi before freezing them. This lets us take the frozen pierogi straight from the freezer and put them in a frying pan to fry up. Boil the pierogi in fairly small batches in a large pot. This makes sure that your pot isn't overcrowded. Boil them until they float, or in the case of the cottage cheese pierogis with the egg, until their internal temperature reaches 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Then set the cooked pierogi on a cooling rack to dry off and continue with the rest of the batch. If you are planning to freeze them after you boil them, then your best bet is to separate them out on a cooling rack and then set them in the freezer. You want to do this until they are fully frozen so that when you transfer them to a Ziploc bag, they do not get stuck together. Now once your pierogis are boiled, you can either eat them as is or you can fry them up for extra tasty goodness. Heat a pan with some oil and butter, then carefully fry the pierogi until they are nice and brown on at least 2 sides. Remove them from the pan and serve them with a nice dollop of sour cream and a light sprinkling of salt. And here we have the finished pierogi. What could be better than egg noodle dough wrapped around mashed potatoes and cheese, fried up and covered with sour cream? Pierogi are a great family activity, and some of my favorite memories are of making pierogi as a family while visiting my grandma's house. As I mentioned in the intro, there are endless possibilities for pierogi filling, so I highly recommend either looking some up or experimenting on your own. Hopefully today's video has inspired you. If it did, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave any comments, ideas, or suggestions for future videos down below. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.